I want to be honest with you. When I volunteered for the Drakovith diplomatic posting, I didn't do it because I was brave. I didn't do it because I believed in interspecies cooperation, or because I had some grand vision of humanity's place in the galaxy. I did it because my rent was 3 months overdue, my ex-wife had taken the dog, and a posting stipend of 42,000 credits sounded like the kind of number that could reset a man's life. That's the truth. I want you to know that going in, because what happened on Velshara Station isn't the story of a hero. It's the story of a very tired human being who just happened to be in the right place at the worst possible moment, and who did the only thing he could think of, which turned out to be the thing nobody else in 11 star systems had managed to do. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Velshara Station first, because if you've never been there, you need to understand what kind of place it is before any of this makes sense. Velshara sits at the gravitational center of the Keth Nebula, which sounds poetic until you actually arrive and realize the nebula is not the beautiful purple and gold thing they show in travel brochures. It's more like living inside a bruise. The light that filters through the gas clouds is this deep, mottled violet brown, the kind of color that makes your eyes feel tired after about 4 minutes. Every surface on the station has a faint iridescent sheen because the particulate matter from the nebula coats everything: your jacket, your instruments, your coffee mug. You stop noticing after a while, the way you stop noticing a smell when you've been in a room long enough. The station itself is enormous, not just large by human standards, enormous by any standard in the known galaxy. Drakovith architecture doesn't think small. It can't. When your species averages 9 feet tall with a wingspan that can clear 12 feet at full extension, you don't build corridors. You build canyons. You build galleries. You build spaces that make a 6-foot human male feel roughly the size of a house cat wandering into a cathedral. I arrived on a cargo transport, the Steadfast Meridian, a Terran-flagged vessel that smelled permanently of hydraulic fluid and someone's attempt to cook curry in zero gravity. The docking bay at Velshara was so large that the entire Steadfast Meridian, a ship that had taken me 11 days to cross 4 star systems on, looked like a child's toy dropped in an aircraft hangar. I remember standing at the top of the boarding ramp and just stopping. There were dragons. I know that sounds ridiculous. I know that's not the technically accurate term. The Drakovith are a fully sapient, space-faring civilization with a Senate seat and a military that could turn the Terran fleet into abstract art in about 40 minutes. They are not dragons. They have names and politics and philosophy and a literary tradition that makes Shakespeare look like a first draft. But standing at the top of that boarding ramp, looking down at the docking bay of Velshara Station, at the vast scaled forms moving through those cathedral corridors, at the way their wings folded and shifted against their bodies like living architecture, at the heat shimmer that rippled off their spines in the cold, recycled station air. I want you to understand that every single cell in my human body was screaming one word, very quietly, at the back of my skull. Dragon. It took me about 3 weeks to stop flinching every time one of them moved suddenly. My job title was Medical Liaison, 3rd grade. In practice, this meant I was responsible for coordinating between the Terran medical team, 3 doctors and 2 nurses, and the Drakovith healer caste, who ran the station's medical facilities and regarded Terran medicine with the tolerant skepticism of master craftspeople watching a child draw with crayons. They were always polite about it, terrifyingly polite. The Drakovith are unfailingly courteous in the way that only beings who could physically lift your entire transport shuttle one-handed can afford to be. The head of the healer caste on Velshara was a Drakovith named Vethara Sol. She was, by Drakovith standards, middle-aged, which meant she was approximately 430 years old. Her scales were a deep forest green with veins of gold running through them that brightened when she was thinking hard about something, which was almost always. She spoke Terran Standard with complete fluency and a slight formal precision that made everything she said sound like it was being engraved on stone. She was also the closest thing I had to a friend on the station, which tells you something about the social landscape of my first year at Velshara. Most of the Drakovith staff treated me with polite distance, not unkindly, just with the general awareness that I was very small, very soft, and operating slightly outside my natural habitat. I ate my meals in the Terran crew annex, slept in a bunk that had been custom-fitted for human dimensions. It felt like sleeping in a shoebox installed inside a ballroom, and spent my days shuttling between the medical wing and administrative offices, trying to make sure our documentation protocols matched across species. It was fine. It was lonely in the specific way that postings abroad can be lonely, surrounded by people, but operating at a permanent cultural remove. I called my sister on scheduled calm days. I read a lot. I started learning Drakovith, which is a tonal language with 4 registers and a subharmonic layer that humans technically can't produce, so I was functionally learning to understand it while speaking a simplified version that Vethara Soul described, charitably, as functional. I got by. And then on the 41st day of my posting, everything changed. The Dragon Emperor came to Velshara. His name, his full, formal name, takes approximately 6 minutes to recite in High Drakovith. For brevity, the Terran diplomatic briefing materials referred to him as Emperor Velkarith XIII, which he apparently found both amusing and slightly endearing, the way you might find a child's drawing of you charming despite the fact that it doesn't really capture your likeness. Emperor Velkarith was the supreme ruler of the Drakovith Imperium, which is not an empire in the human sense, but rather a loose confederation of 47 star systems that had operated under a single ruling lineage for approximately 12,000 years. He was also, by any objective measure, the most physically imposing living thing I had ever seen. I caught my first glimpse of him from the observation gallery above the main diplomatic reception hall, which is where the Terran support staff were permitted to observe the formal arrival ceremony, without being in the actual space where enormous things were happening. He was larger than the other Drakovith, not dramatically so, but noticeably, in the way that certain individuals just seemed to take up more space than physics entirely explains. His scales were black, a black so deep and unreflective it looked like someone had cut a Drakovith-shaped hole in the universe. His eyes were amber, lit from within with a golden light that pulsed very slightly when he moved, like the embers of something that hadn't fully cooled. He walked through the reception hall and the Drakovith officials around him, beings who could individually have dismantled a fighter squadron, went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with protocol. It was instinctive. It was the quiet of things recognizing something older and more fundamental than themselves. I stood at the observation gallery railing and watched and felt, very clearly, the specific chill of a mammal who has just realized it is sharing a room with a predator of a completely different order of magnitude. But here's what nobody told me, what wasn't in any of the briefing documents, what I hadn't found in any of the Drakovith cultural primers I'd been reading for 6 weeks. The Emperor had brought his child. Her name was Velshira. She was 9 years old by Drakovith reckoning, which translated to approximately 3 human years in terms of developmental stage. She was small for a Drakovith, which still meant she was slightly larger than a Shetland pony, with scales the color of her father's but with an iridescent quality to them, like black opals, that shifted from deep indigo to violet to a smoky green depending on how the light hit them. Her wings were still the slightly oversized, slightly uncertain wings of a young Drakovith, and she held them folded tight against her body the way children hold their arms when they're nervous. She arrived on the station 3 days after her father, carried in on a sealed transport with a retinue of handlers that outnumbered the station's entire security detail. Nobody told me she was coming. Nobody told the Terran medical team she was coming. The first I heard about it was when Vetharasol found me in the medication storage annex, reorganizing pharmaceutical catalogs, and said, in a voice that was extremely precise and extremely controlled, "Warrant Officer Marsh, I require your assistance with a matter of some urgency." I'd learned enough in 6 weeks to recognize what that tone meant coming from Vetharasol. I put down the catalogs. "What's happened?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. For a 400-year-old being who could crack the hull plating with her tail if she lost her temper, she had the most expressive silences. "The Imperial child," she said carefully, "is unwell." That word, unwell, turned out to be doing a lot of work. The Imperial child was not unwell in any clinical sense. Vetharasol walked me through the medical wing to the sealed suite that had been prepared for the princess. I was the first non-Drakovith, first Terran, first anything other than Imperial staff to be admitted to that suite, a fact that I didn't fully appreciate until later, and I could hear it from 20 feet down the corridor. Crying. Not soft crying. Not the kind of crying you can politely pretend not to notice. The kind of crying that had clearly been going on for a very long time and had not produced any resolution, and was not going to produce any resolution through the application of more time. The kind of crying that had exhausted itself and then kept going because there was nothing else to do. Drakovith young don't cry the way human children cry. There's no close equivalent. What Velshira was doing was more like a sustained, resonant vibration that you felt in your chest before you heard it. It came in waves, each one starting low and building to something that made the walls of the medical suite hum faintly. It was the most desolate sound I'd ever heard in my life, and I've worked in hospital wards, and I've been in disaster relief zones, and I've heard things that I don't talk about much. It was the quality of it, the loneliness of it. Whatever this child was feeling, it went very deep. I stood in the doorway and looked in. The suite was enormous, scaled for Drakovith, naturally, and the princess was curled in the center of it on a thermal resting platform, which is the closest Drakovith equivalent to a bed. She was coiled around herself in the particular way of Drakovith young in distress, wings tucked, tail wrapped around her body, head lowered. Surrounding her at careful distances were 4 Imperial handlers, senior Drakovith in formal court attire, who were maintaining expressions of absolute professional composure while radiating the distinct energy of beings who had been awake for a very long time and were starting to run out of options. There was also a medical officer from the Imperial retinue, Vetharasol's counterpart, introduced to me as Healer Prime Corvith, who had the look of someone who had exhausted every tool in their diagnostic kit and was now staring at the problem with the hollow eyes of a professional whose expertise has failed to produce an outcome. Nobody was touching the child. Nobody was anywhere near the child. I looked at Vetharasol. "How long?" I said. 31 hours, she said, "since arrival on the station." 31 hours of continuous crying. "Has she eaten?" I asked. "She has refused nourishment," said Healer Prime Corvith, without looking at me. His Terran standard was more clipped than Vetharasol's, precise in the way of someone who'd learned it as a diplomatic necessity rather than a genuine interest. "She has refused all soothing protocols. She has refused physical comfort. She has not communicated in any intelligible pattern since her distress began." "What started it?" I said. There was a brief, weighted pause. "She was separated from her companion animal," said one of the handlers. The one who introduced herself as Attendant Selvara, a younger Drakovith with copper-tinted scales who looked like she hadn't slept since the princess arrived. "Her companion animal," I repeated. "A creature she has kept since hatching," Selvara said carefully. "A small creature. It was inadvertently left behind during the boarding process. It is currently aboard the Imperial flagship, which is en route but will not arrive at Velshara for approximately She paused, calculating. 9 station cycles. 9 station cycles was approximately 4 human days. I stood there in the doorway, listening to the Dragon Emperor's daughter cry, and I understood the situation completely. A 3-year-old human equivalent, separated from her comfort animal, in an unfamiliar environment, surrounded by stressed adults who were all trying very hard to help and who were, entirely through no fault of their own, making everything worse by trying. I know this situation. I have met this situation, not with Dracovath children in space stations in nebulae, obviously, but the shape of it, the emotional architecture of it, I recognize the way you recognize a familiar piece of music played in a different key. I turned to Vethara Soul. "Why am I here?" I said. "What do you think I can do?" She held my gaze for a moment with those gold-veined green eyes. "I don't know," she said, which from Vethara Soul was approximately equivalent to a formal declaration of professional desperation. "But we have tried everything within Dracovath protocol. We have tried everything Healer Prime Corvith has available. We have tried sensory regulation, thermal modulation, pheromonal soothing compounds, harmonic resonance therapy." She stopped. "The Emperor has been notified. He is concluding an unavoidable session of imperial business and will come directly after. But his handlers believe that the princess's emotional state, if not resolved, may escalate beyond." She paused. "May escalate," I said. "Young Dracovath," Vethara Soul said carefully, "in extreme prolonged distress can produce a harmonic that is damaging to station infrastructure." I stared at her. "She's 3 years old," I said. "She is also a Dracovath Imperial," Vethara Soul said. "And she has been crying for 31 hours. So that was the situation. The Dragon Emperor's child was going to, in the most technical, clinical sense, potentially crack the walls of Velshara Station if she kept crying long enough, and no one in the known galaxy had been able to make her stop. And somehow, I was the next idea. I want to be very clear. Nobody in that room thought I was going to succeed. They had a medical team, a therapy protocol, 4 trained handlers, and a healer prime with 12 centuries of pediatric Dracovath care between them, and not one of them had made a dent. The reason they called me was not because they thought the human would solve it. It was because they had run out of other things to try, and the human was there, and he at least wasn't going to make things worse. That's the kind of confidence you want going into a situation. Really steadies the nerves. I looked at the princess. She hadn't acknowledged my arrival at all. The crying continued in those deep, resonant waves, each one vibrating in my sternum like a very sad subwoofer. Her iridescent scales had lost some of their shimmer. They'd gone darker, flatter. The colors muted in the way you sometimes see in animals that are genuinely distressed, when the energy that usually goes into color maintenance gets redirected somewhere more urgent. I thought about what I knew about children. Then I thought about what I knew about animals. Then, and this is the thought that changed everything, I thought about what both of those things have in common when they're frightened and grieving, and surrounded by anxious adults who want very much to help. They can feel the anxiety. They can always feel the anxiety, and the anxiety makes it worse. Every adult in that room was broadcasting distress on whatever frequency this child was capable of reading. Healer Prime Corvith's professional stillness was the controlled stillness of someone managing a crisis. The handler's composure was the composure of people who were aware that they were failing at something with enormous consequences. Vethara Soul, brilliant, steady, 400-year-old Vethara Soul, was standing at the door with the specific tension of someone who has called in their last option. The child could feel all of it. She had been surrounded for 31 hours by people who were desperately trying to fix her, and she could feel that she was something to be fixed, and it was making everything worse, and more people trying harder to fix her was not going to change that loop. I understood something then. I took a breath. I walked into the room. Not toward the child. That's important. Not toward anything in particular. I walked into the room the way you walk into a room where you're not planning to do anything. The specific gait of someone who has arrived somewhere and isn't immediately sure what they're going to do next. Unhurried, purposeless, present without agenda. Attendant Selvara made a sound that might have been a question, and I held up one hand, a small gesture, palm out, just wait, and she went still. I sat down on the floor. Not near the princess. Not far away either, just somewhere in the middle distance of the room, on the floor with my back resting against a support column. I sat the way you sit when you've decided to be somewhere for a while, not performing rest, just resting. The crying continued. Of course it did. I didn't try to stop it. I didn't make soothing sounds. I didn't approach. I didn't look at her directly. I looked somewhere past her. The way you don't make direct eye contact with a dog that's scared, because direct eye contact from a stranger is a form of pressure, and pressure is the last thing you want to add. I just sat there. About 3 minutes passed. The crying continued, and this is subtle, and I might be imagining it in retrospect, I'll admit that the character of it seemed to shift very slightly. The waves were the same, but there was something in the pauses between them that felt almost like listening. I don't know, I can't prove that. What I can tell you is that after approximately 5 minutes of me sitting on the floor doing absolutely nothing, the child's head moved, very slightly. Just a fractional tilt, like a cat hearing a sound at the edge of its hearing range. She'd noticed me. Not in a frightened way, not in a curious way, just noticed me, in the way things notice something new that isn't doing anything alarming. I didn't react. I kept breathing slowly. I kept my posture loose. I thought about nothing important. I was aware that I needed to be actually relaxed, not performing relaxation, because children and animals catch the difference. I thought about the hydraulic fluid smell of the steadfast meridian. I thought about the color of the nebula light through the observation windows. Small thoughts, quiet thoughts. Behind me, I was dimly aware of the handlers and Healer Prime Corvith maintaining their positions, with what I imagined was increasing bewilderment. About 8 minutes in, I heard the crying shift. It didn't stop, but it dropped in intensity. The waves came a little further apart, a little softer at the peak. Like a storm that's been going for a long time and has used up the worst of its energy. I still didn't move. I didn't react to the shift. I didn't look at her. I just kept breathing. Another few minutes passed. Then I heard, very close, and without any transition, that I'd caught breathing that wasn't mine. She had moved. The princess had uncurled from her position and crossed the room quietly, and was now standing approximately 3 feet to my right, looking at me. I didn't turn toward her. I let her look. I stayed completely still, breathing, looking at the middle distance. I heard Attendant Selvara inhale sharply across the room. I heard Vetharasol in the doorway become very, very quiet in a way that was different from all her previous quietness. The crying had stopped. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me on the floor, the child standing 3 feet away, looking at me with those amber eyes that were wet with something that performed the same function as tears in her species and left faint iridescent streaks on her scales. Eventually, I did turn to look at her. Not quickly, very slowly, the way you move around things you don't want to startle. I turned my head and I looked at her. She was staring at me with an expression that I had absolutely no framework for interpreting. But the nearest thing I could map it to was the expression of a child who has been crying for a very long time and has just arrived, exhausted and surprised, at the territory on the other side of crying. I said the only thing I could think of. I said, "Hey." Not hello. Not any of the Drakovith formal greetings I'd been carefully studying for 6 weeks, which all have elaborate tonal components and register considerations and subclauses of social hierarchy. Just hey, informal and small and just barely louder than the ambient hum of the station's ventilation. She blinked. Her wings shifted, just slightly. One of them half extended and then folded back, the way a bird ruffles and resets. She made a sound. It wasn't language, it was somewhere before language. A small, resonant sound, just one note, somewhere between a question and an acknowledgement. I said, "Yeah, I know." What happened in the next few minutes is the part that apparently got recorded and transmitted to 11 different places, and became the thing that people subsequently asked me to explain. And I want to be honest with you. I can explain the mechanics of it, but I can't fully explain why it worked, because I'm not entirely sure. My best guess is that the gap between unfamiliar and soothing is smaller than it sounds. When everything familiar has stopped being soothing, sometimes the unfamiliar is the only thing that's neutral enough to not carry the weight of all that failed comfort. I started talking. Not to her exactly, not performing speech at her, just talking, the way you talk out loud when you're doing something else and the words are just accompanying you. I talked about the steadfast meridian. I described the curry smell that had permeated the cargo hold and how I'd never managed to identify whether it was a person or a substance or just some kind of olfactory ghost that lived in the ship's ventilation. I talked about the color of the nebula outside the station windows and how every morning the light was a slightly different shade of bruised violet. I talked about the coffee machine in the Terran crew annex that had been malfunctioning since my second day and dispensed coffee at a temperature that was technically above boiling. None of it mattered. None of it was meant to matter to her. She didn't understand Terran standard, or if she did, she was far too young for the vocabulary. What mattered was the rhythm of it, the sound of a voice doing something other than worrying. She sat down. Not curled up in distress. Just sat, the way Drakovith young sit, settled onto her haunches with her tail coiled around herself, and her wings folded neatly and her head tilted, listening to sounds she couldn't translate but that apparently had some quality she found. I don't have a better word for this, tolerable. Attendant Selvara made a sound that I'm fairly sure was the Drakovith equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Vethara Sol, still in the doorway, was very still. I kept talking. I talked about my sister, Nora, who was 12 years older than me and who had taught me to fold origami cranes when I was very small, not because she had any deep interest in origami, but because she had a 4-year-old brother who wouldn't stop crying one particular afternoon, and the paper cranes were the first thing she'd thought of. I remembered those cranes very clearly, imperfect, asymmetrical, made from the pages of a magazine, and how she'd hung them from my bedroom ceiling on pieces of thread, and how I'd fallen asleep watching them turn in the draft from the ventilation, and how completely unremarkable it was, and how it had worked completely. I didn't look at the princess when I was talking. I looked at the wall across from me, and I spoke to the middle distance, and I let the words just go where they went. At some point she moved closer. I didn't make a thing of it. I kept talking. She settled in about 2 feet to my right, and after a moment she lowered her head, not quite onto me, but near me, in the general vicinity of me, the way animals rest near something they've decided is safe without committing to actual contact. The crying had been over for about 20 minutes by now. Healer Prime Corvith had left the room very quietly about 10 minutes in. I found out later he'd gone to update the Emperor's personal staff. Attendant Selvara was still there, in the far corner of the room, barely breathing. Vethara Sol was still in the doorway. The Emperor came 40 minutes later. I heard him before I saw him, a change in the air pressure of the corridor, a shift in the quality of the station's ambient hum, and then the distinct sound of someone very large moving very carefully so as not to make a sound, which is, in its own way, the loudest thing in the world. He appeared in the doorway and stopped. I didn't stand up. I want to explain that choice because it sounds like a protocol breach, and technically it was, but not one I made without thinking. Getting up quickly would have changed the atmosphere of the room, and the atmosphere of the room was the only thing currently working. So I stayed on the floor and turned my head slowly, the way I'd turned to look at the princess, and I looked at the emperor. He was looking at his daughter. Valshira was asleep. She'd gone under about 15 minutes earlier, the gradual, heavy, boneless slide into sleep of something that has been exhausted for a very long time and has finally arrived somewhere safe enough to let go. She was on the floor next to me, her side rising and falling slowly, her scales very gradually recovering their iridescent shimmer as her body relaxed out of the distress that had suppressed it. Emperor Velkarith looked at his sleeping daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I have sat with this memory many times in the years since, and I always come back to the same conclusion. I don't have adequate language for what was in his expression at that moment. Human emotional vocabulary wasn't built for Dracovath faces, which work on different axes. But there was something there that I recognized across the species gap as clearly as I'd recognized the sound of a grieving child who just needed someone to sit with her. Relief. The specific, profound, slightly disorienting relief of a parent whose child has been suffering and is not suffering anymore. I held his gaze for a moment, and then I looked back at Velshira, because I figured that was what he wanted to do too. He came into the room. He moved as quietly as I have ever seen anything that large move, with an attention to each placement of weight that was clearly deliberate, clearly practiced, clearly the movement of a parent who has done this before, who knows the geography of the territory between a child finally sleeping and a child woken. He crossed the room and settled near his daughter with an economy of motion that seemed physically improbable for something his size, and he looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said, and this was in Terran standard, which I found out later he spoke fluently and had never previously chosen to use publicly, "What did you do?" It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not political, the question of a father who needs to understand something. I thought about how to answer it. "Nothing really," I said. I stayed, and I didn't try to fix it, and I talked about nothing, and I let her decide when it was over." He was quiet. 31 hours, he said very quietly. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. About the companion animal. That's a hard thing to be missing when everything else is already unfamiliar." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You are the first being on this station who has spoken to me about my daughter and not about my title." I didn't know what to say to that. "She's a kid who misses her pet," I said. That's not a title situation." Something happened in his expression that I can only describe as a shift in the weather. "No," he said after a moment. "It is not. She slept for 6 hours. Vetharasol found me in the corridor outside the suite afterward, sitting against the wall with a cup of the terrible too-hot coffee from the crew annex, which someone, I never found out who, had apparently brought up for me at some point. She sat down next to me, which, given the proportional difference between our sizes, required a certain elegant folding of limbs, but she did it without apparent self-consciousness. We sat there for a few minutes just sitting. "The Emperor's staff has transmitted a formal request to Terran Diplomatic Corps Command," she said, "requesting your reassignment to Velshara for an additional term." I looked at her. "An additional term," I said. 3 station years," she said. "At an increased stipend." I thought about my apartment back on Terra, my ex-wife, the dog, the 3 months of unpaid rent that had started this whole trajectory. "The princess," I started, "has been told about you," Vetharasol said. "By her father. She is asking, the attendant has relayed this, she is asking when the small quiet one will come back." I rubbed the bridge of my nose. "Small quiet one," I said. In Drakovith, Vetharasol said, and I could hear something in her voice that was the closest she generally came to warmth. It is actually rather a compliment. We sat there a while longer. Outside the observation windows of the corridor, the Keth Nebula moved through its slow, ancient breathing. The gas clouds shifting and folding in the way they'd been shifting and folding for 10,000 years before any of us were born, in colors that no briefing document had been able to prepare me for. Deep violet and bruised gold, and a green at the edges that was the exact color of Vetharasol's scales in good lighting. I thought about Nora and the origami cranes and the imperfect things that work. I thought about a child asleep in an unfamiliar room, her scales slowly recovering their shine. Yeah, I said eventually, okay.